Reading 48 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 2. Verdlip, December 2nd, 1944. Introductory Note on Esotericism. I want to speak briefly about esoteric schools and the idea of esotericism in general. There is an immense amount of literature connected with esoteric schools that have existed at different periods of history. Ordinary history, as you know, is nothing much more than a history of crime and violence. If you open any book on history, you will find nothing of esoteric history. On many occasions, Mr. Ouspensky said to me that the overcoming of violence was our final aim, and that all negative emotions which engender so many evil consequences, not only among individual people but in a national sense, spring from man as violence. Now, violence is not a thing that can be overcome right away like that. I will give you an example of what I would call the beginning of violence. In the Sufi school of esotericism, which came in after Mahomet and worked on the Quran, and in fact gave an entirely different explanation of the Quran, there was a so-called mystical poet called Sadi. As a youth, Sadi was very religious in the ordinary sense, and on one occasion when the Quran was being read to a class, he said to his father that he had noticed that many of the boys went to sleep, and he thought that this was very bad. His father said to him, "So all you have got from this reading of the Quran is nothing but finding fault with others? I assure you, my son, it would have been better had you been asleep like those boys you criticized." Now, perhaps you will not see that this is the beginning of violence. Perhaps you do not see what I mean. Is intolerance the beginning of violence? Is feeling you are better than others the beginning of violence? If you think that you are better than others, superior to others in the wrong way, do you think that this can bring about violence? Here lies a very deep research, a very long path of understanding. You remember the old esoteric symbol of the lion with its paws cut off, of which we made a plaster cast at Taiapon's, which we put up in one of the rooms. I often wonder what the military who took over the place thought of this plaque. Violence always comes from thinking one can do. Now, violence always breeds violence. That means that everything you do from violence passes into the world both as a triad and an octave that can only produce the reaction of violence. We see today violence up against violence everywhere. We see the law, a tooth for a tooth, exemplified in every direction of life. We see violence creating violence, violent machines creating new violent machines. Christ said, "Ye have heard that it was said of old time, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say unto you, resist not him that is evil." It is impossible to understand this saying except on the scale of ourselves. On the scale of life, it is a different matter as far as we are concerned. But on the scale of ourselves, it is something that we can begin to comprehend. Practically, once we understand that violence always arises from the feeling of superiority, that we are better than others. Sadi thought he was better than others. He congratulated himself on his virtue. You will always be violent if you feel intolerant of others in the wrong way, if you take it for granted that you are better. More consciously, you may see where you are better without feeling the violence of intolerance. Now, later on I will speak about different schools, the remains of which are incorporated into surviving literature, but I will only add that all thinking one can do becomes violence very easily. Do you remember the 11th chapter of Genesis, where it is said at the opening, quote, "And the whole earth was of one language and one speech," end quote. This means that there was a time, which I remember G used to speak about, when people under the influence of esotericism were all one and so had a common speech. In this connection, G once said in France that when esotericism had a central control, for a short time everyone was taught to write towards the center of government, geographically speaking, and seem to indicate that this is the reason why we write, as it were, from left to right, and other nations from right to left, or from below upwards, and so on. I only understood the idea that there was some central government quite different from anything we know, in which all nations were under one jurisdiction and, as it were, always wrote towards it. Whether he meant this seriously or not, I do not know. Now, to return to this ideal state of humanity. You will see what happened. They began to think they could do. They identify with their knowledge and understanding, as man inevitably does when he begins to sleep. And so the account goes on to say, quote, "And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a valley, and they dwelt there." End quote. This means that they went away from esoteric teaching, that is, the east, and went to a lower level, the valley, which means a lower level of understanding. Then they began to build. Notice how they built. Quote, "And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar." End quote. You know already that stone means truth on a certain level. But they made brick instead of stone. That is, they invented truth. They substituted human-made truth for esoteric truth, and so they built a city and a tower and came under the wrath of God, which means the laws of esotericism. They said they would build a tower to reach to heaven. This means they thought they could overcome esoteric truth, or the Word of God, as John calls it. They passed into self-worship, the worship of their own understanding, and so thought they could do. However, the explanation of this parable will be given later on in a chapter on the Gospels. Nowadays, science has given man the idea that he can do, but psychologically we are all connected with some other medium with which this work is concerned, and to which we can become gradually more sensitive. The object of this place down here in Gurdjieff is to keep alive the teaching of the work. That is esotericism, in spite of all that goes on in the world of violence. This is a place that is like an oasis. Whether you appreciate this oasis or not depends on your understanding of the work. Here we think differently. Here we talk of different things. Here we keep alive something that does not depend on the pendulum of violence.